Hey friends, here we are. We're in the book of Matthew already. So we begin Route 66 in the New Testament. We're going to go through each of the 27 books of the New Testament. And today we're talking about Matthew. Matthew is the first of the Gospels. And Matthew is a great book. Well, I think they're all great books. But Matthew, interestingly, is like Luke, another book we're going to talk about in a week or two. Matthew got a lot of his data from the book of Mark, which is the second book of the New Testament. In fact, scholars label this as mining of data by Luke and Matthew from the Gospel of Mark, and they label it as Q. Q, like the word queen, and Q stands for Quella, which means source. So they got their data, they got their of many of their facts as they put their Gospels together from the book of Mark. Now, again, each of these authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, kind of wrote from their own perspective. And Matthew was a Jew, so he wrote from a very Jewish perspective. He focused on genealogy an awful lot. He included the story of the birth of Christ at the beginning and his resurrection at the end. Neither one of those stories are part of the book of Mark. He makes a point of the fact that Christ is a descendant of David and that he's a royal Messiah. He feels like he was a great teacher, greater than Moses, obviously. But Matthew, interestingly, he draws a bit of a parallel. He sees a parallel from when Herod died and Joseph brought the family out of Egypt. He compares that to the fact that he compares that to Christ and Israel's exodus from Egypt. I think it's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll get into that at some point in a little more detail. Interestingly, Matthew is the only book that contains the story of the Great Commission, a challenge that Jesus gave us in his final time on earth. The Sermon on the Mount, which is obviously quite famous, even people who aren't followers of Christ are familiar with it, shows in the book of Matthew that Jesus had the authority to deliver defined interpretations of the law of Moses. Matthew is also one of the only one of the four Gospels that uses the term ecclesia, which is a Greek word for church. The church lives under the sole authority of Jesus, according to Matthew, and we receive our entire identity from him. Now, Matthew also, he uses reference to the Old Testament. He refers back to the Old Testament more than any one of the other of the gospel writers because he is really specific in his understanding that Christ came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Matthew is one that demonstrates more than any of the writers the fact that the Old Testament isn't something that was being replaced. The New Testament is exactly that. It's an additional testament that fulfilled the law of God, basically. All three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, present comparable stories, and that's why they're called synoptic, because they present present common stories. But the book of John, by contrast, does not, so it's not part of the synoptic gospels. Matthew also introduces the concept that the present time is already the end time. Think about that. The present time is already the end time because Jesus has already invaded this area. So I pray that you will get a lot out of this as we go through Route 66 and as you dig into Matthew from his perspective on how he saw the Lord Jesus Christ. How do you see Jesus?